Let's review every card coming to Marvel Snap in April. No fooling. These videos are risky. They're ripe for clip farming, and a contextless 5-star rating system can elide some of the nuances that really change how cards are appreciated in Marvel Snap. But we do them anyway. Why? Because you want them, I want to do them, and in a year or so, I'll be able to clip farm them myself as I review my own reviews. With all of that said, let's jump into card number 1. The Season Pass card Strife is a 4/6 with an objective that triggers after you've played 3 on-reveal cards. Once you've done that, he will use the highest cost on reveal in your hand, in much the same way that a Firehair would. Now, this is a well-worn type of card. It is a doubler, so I think people will think that that means that this card can't be anything but amazing. But I think it's important to understand the recent context that has made doublers so powerful. The doublers that work with Star-Lord are typically ones that work after Star-Lord. They're ones that apply to Star-Lord. And more than that, without Star-Lord, they're not really seeing a ton of play outside of that. In other words, the context for doublers being good is related to the context of having worthwhile things to double. And while I do think there are some targets for Strife that seem particularly compelling to someone like me, who is focused mostly on winning games of Marvel Snap, I'm not sure there are as many as you'd like. There is not a lot of depth when you ask what are big expensive on reveals that you want to be actually copying or playing a couple times per game. What are they? Because there actually aren't all that many big cards whose power is mostly wrapped up in their on reveal. For one reason or another, that just hasn't seemed to be a type of card that they made a lot of. Now, there are a few, and I think most people thinking about the Marvel Snap card pool will come up with at least the first 2, Fin Fang Foom and Shou Lao. And then maybe along the same lines of Shou Lao, you get to Zombie Giant Man, and then maybe you get to Galactus. These are cards where most of the power is wrapped up in the honor reveal. They're more expensive than Strife, so you actually are interested in it, and sometimes you'll really want that second copy of them. Fin Fang Foom, Zombie Giant Man, it's actually multiplicative there, whereas Foom and Shou Lao are just good, and Galactus, you care about the specific timing. But I also think that it's important that we're talking about Strife as if he's just a card that says, do that, when he's not. He is a card that's going to require you to play other on reveals. He is a card whose timing is within your control, but might cause you to go outside of what you would already be wanting to do. And he is a card that requires you to have the target that you want to be targeting in your hand. He's less a second Fin Fang Foom and more a second Fin Fang Foom when you have Fin Fang Foom and also do this other stuff. So largely, the places I see him as being beneficial are, of course, in the zombie list, if we assume that that exists in a world where Gambit Horseman is blowing up your zero-cost horde for free, potentially in Shou Lao lists, potentially in Fin Fang Foom lists, and potentially in Galactus lists. I don't know what he does outside of that. And maybe that's enough. Like, we've seen one specific build of a deck become strong enough that it justified every card in it as being a good card because they were the cards that worked with this. I'm talking, of course, about Star-Lord, right? This guy feels a little closer to a support piece to something that is elite than the thing that is elite on its own. I'm not saying this guy is potential man, because I do fully believe that he will do things with Fin Fang Foom, maybe with Galactus, maybe with Shou Lao, although it's currently unclear to me whether you would rather be doing a second Shou Lao or whether you would rather just, play a card that effectively doubles the buff anyway. Unclear, but I do think that it is possible. Obviously, I'll be starting with Pixie, Strife, Shou Lao, and Fin Fang Foom, so a lot of different things. It'll be hard to disentangle what exactly he's doing. I expect him to be good, but I don't know that I expect him to be great. So with that in mind, I am going to give Strife 3.5 stars out of 5. Techno-Organic Virus is in the Super Premium Season Pass. It's a one-cost card that infects the cards at the location that it's played on your side of the board. To infect a card is to replace its text with an ongoing ability that gives the card +1 power for each of the Techno-Organic Viruses that you have played this game. After that, Techno-Organic Virus adds a copy of itself to your hand that costs 2 more. So you play it, you get one that costs 3, you get one that costs 5, presumably you get one that costs 7. Hopefully no one's ever actually doing that. There are 2 cards that interact with this card profitably. The first is Mobius and Mobius, which allows you to play repeated one-cost versions of Techno-Organic Virus. Techno-Organic Virus feels like a card that is a meaningful buff to something in a Sauron space, but I'm not necessarily sure that the deck currently exists that wants to do all of this stuff. With Mobius, it's Kitty Pryde-esque, but a lot of what Kitty Pryde does is trigger the things that actually give you additional bonuses for playing repeated one-drops, where this card actually would say, take those abilities away. Let's say you wanted to play this card on a Hope Summers lane. Well, I hope you enjoyed that 1 energy. I'm not even sure you'd get it. This is a card that I think is likely to be siloed to Sauron, and if you are able to Mobius this, it seems very compelling in a linear scaling world, but I don't know that it goes very far outside of, say, the Supergiant space. When I see this card, I see a card that as a linear scaling card that requires you to invest on the board is going to want you to do things like play Debris. I'm not sure you go full Aussie, but I believe that you're probably playing Debris, you're playing above rate cards, and then maybe you're getting rid of their abilities by using this and giving yourself some extra points, which means, crucially, you're going to need ways to keep your opponent down. And those ways, Mobius is probably already in your deck. Maybe you'll be able to get a Cosmo in there. Maybe you'll be Negasonic Supergianting. Then you start to actually see what a deck could be. I think that this could be a meaningful addition to that package. I can very easily see it being the right thing to do in a Supergiant Sauron kind of package. I find it very hard to credit Techno-Organic Virus with any of that, though. If this card is to succeed, it will succeed on the back of Supergiant. It will succeed on the back of Negasonic. It will succeed on the back of Mobius. I don't think this card is going to be doing a lot of the lifting in those shells. And I suspect that the overwhelming likelihood for my perception of this card is that this will end up being a card that is cool and is interesting and is strong, but ultimately a little bit too finicky outside of specifically decks where it is removing the negative text on something like a Red Skull. For this reason, I'm going to give it a solid 2.5 out of 5 stars, a role player's reward. Wolverine Horseman of War is a 4/3 with an objective that checks to see if Wolverine has 5 or more power. When it does, it'll give 3 points of power to everything, or to one thing at every location. Apologies. So it'll give 3 points of power to something at Wolverine's location and also to the other 2 locations. In other words, a bit of a 4/12. I don't know that this card's time is now. I would like to be able to play him in a buff slop deck, which is to say just a deck that's just like, all the cards that say buff on them and then also pay you out for buffing him. I can see that being meaningful. I like the idea of putting him behind a Captain Carter. The problem is he costs 4, and he's just not that big on his own. This guy feels like he is a point of cost off or several points of power off before I actually start seriously looking at him as a card I want to be investing in, which is a shame because A, it's Wolverine and it's very cool, but I would like this card to actually be something that is played in these buff decks because ultimately the problem with Wolverine isn't what he can do, it's what he can't do. And what he can't do is measure up to a show allow. Why would I use my Maverick on a Wolverine or try to buff my Maverick with a Wolverine when I could simply show allow that Maverick for way more points. There isn't enough incentive for me to do something in the buff space that involves this card. Why would I play this card in my deck instead of an Iron Lad that can copy a Brood, that can copy a Captain Carter, that can copy a Maverick? Why would I be playing the 4/3 instead? I should be playing more expensive cards. I almost think that part of what I see when I look at this card is a card that should either cost 3 or should cost 5, because right now it's in competition with things that it probably can't beat. But if you moved it up the curve and gave it the points to compensate for that, let's say this card costs 5, but it's giving out +5 buffs. You know what I mean? That's a much more interesting card in the context of what those things are doing. And even then, it doesn't necessarily compare favorably to a Show Allow. It doesn't even really necessarily compare favorably to a Namora. This is a card that I want to be excited for. I will be playing that buff slop deck, but I strongly suspect that he will not see use until we have more cards that are like Maverick. And by like Maverick, I mean are both input and output for a buff strategy. As is, I don't think enough of those cards exist, and I don't think he's a compelling enough use of 4 energy in the deck that is playing them. This is something I'm prepared to revisit, but that's my initial take. So with all of that said, I think he is going to be a 2 out of 5. Series 4's Askanison will come out of Deadpool's Diner in a few days, but for now, we are content merely to look at what he could be. Askanison is an activate card whose activate scales every time you're winning the lane he's in. So at the beginning of each turn, if you're winning his lane, his activate's number will go up. What number is that? Well, glad you asked. Askanison's activate creates a card. The cost of the card it will create is what goes up every turn. So you play him on turn 2, you win on turn 3, you win on turn 4, you win on turn 5, you win on turn 6. Well, ain't that interesting? So he's going to be able to make 4 cost cards effectively. Like, this is a card that is going to be able to make 4 cost cards some amount of the time. That's where you want it to go, by the way. Like, it will be a thing that you are specifically attempting to do a lot of the time, is get him to 4, because as someone who's played a fair bit of Cersei, a fair bit of Merlin Polymorph, 4 tends to be the sweet spot for like raw stats. There tend not to be too many horrendous things in there, but when you get to 5, there's some really bad rolls because you start getting things like, you know, Sarah in there, and Sarah's a great card, but you're really only looking for stats out of this guy because you're activating him pretty late a lot of the time. You want your stuff to show up and just be a big body when you play this. I personally think that this is a card that seems like it would go in Aurora decks. Anything that is an activate and makes another body seems compelling there, but I don't know that it goes in Doom 2099 Aurora decks because I just don't know how good they are at actually doing this. Like, how good is a Doom 2099 deck at winning an individual lane? And this is the important part, without giving up future ability to play into that lane. Like, I am not sure that a deck that can fill the board as much as that deck can is particularly compelling. But that said, I mean, there is a card that is a very nice partner for this, that of course being Iska the Unbeaten. Quite a pickle you can put your opponent in with this. Largely, I think that he's going to need a specific reason to play instead of being a generic card like an Iron Patriot would be. But in certain metagames where your opponents are simply not pressuring the early board, I can see him just being a useful piece. Largely, I would say that I expect this card to be a 2 out of 5. Archangel is a card that is very clearly aimed at people who are tinkerers, at people who are trying to figure out unique ways to apply things. I am not one of those people. I'm a straightforward, play good decks kind of player. So this is definitely a card that isn't necessarily aimed at me. To use the Magic psychographics terms, I am a Spike, this is a Johnny card. Archangel has an objective. At 2/3, he will revive one of your dead cards once you have destroyed 4 cards. The problems I see for Archangel are largely that I don't really know what the hell I'm supposed to do with him. And that's not to say there's nothing to do with Archangel. I think there are things you can do. Like, you can put him in your normal destroy deck and, hopefully try to blow something up that isn't something that doesn't go to the graveyard. Because I think that's the number one thing that's going to trip people up about this card. This card will not revive your Deadpool because your Deadpool isn't dead. This card won't revive your Wolverine because your Wolverine isn't dead. So what are you going to put into your destroy deck that you want to destroy and then to revive as well? And I really don't know what that is, and I don't know that it's worth playing a 2-cost for. So if we assume he's probably not going in destroy, I've been trying to figure out ways to make the Sholau stuff work. I can't find too many of them. Like, yes, you can have him on the board and have Sholau be the 4th thing you destroy, but like, if Sholau is the 4th thing you destroy, your destroy deck, you destroyed 3 things the entire game. What are we doing here, right? I kind of think that the specific way this guy wants to be played is in some sort of, Phoenix Force Firehair kind of deal. The problem is he's a one-shot, and I don't know that he'd be particularly good there. The solution is, I still think he's likely to be better than Elixir in those decks. And those decks do play Elixir. It's just that, they have a lot of options in those spots. And I don't know how reliably those decks are actually going to be able to kill 4 things, because he might not even end up being better than Elixir, right? And I think that's really where we get down to here. When I look at this card, I see a card that I cannot confidently say is going to be better than Elixir. And I realize that this is the kind of thing where it would be very conceivable to accuse me of having a blind spot. It's a very realistic thing. When we eventually get to KMBest reviews, because I cannot stop copying Trump SC, we'll revisit this at some point, presumably. But right now, what I look at when I see this card is a card I cannot be sure is better than Elixir. And that means it's a 1-star card. Polaris, Horseman of Pestilence, is a 2/2 with an objective that just puts a card from your hand onto the board and a condition that requires you to have afflicted up to, 5 negative power, whether that be 5 negative power afflicted to one card with, say, a Selene from last season, or more power afflicted to one card with like an Omega Sentinel, or just, a hazmat on a bunch of stuff that adds up to at least 5. Either one of those will work, and she does fill a fairly nice niche in the Afflict deck. The Afflict deck has a sort of fundamental problem, though, and I think this is where you would expect me to start talking about Luke Cage. That's not really the fundamental problem that I want to get at, although it is one, and we'll talk about him later. The fundamental problem that the Afflict deck has is that it is in a sort of class of decks that is perhaps a little bit out of time. What do these decks have in common? Arishem, Wiccan, Afflict. Largely, those are decks whose greatest prey was low power control decks. Those are decks that beat up on decks that used to sort of play a lot of Shang-Chi's type stuff. They used to play a lot of, I'm going to use my removal to make your guys smaller and generally win the game with a relatively small amount of power. And those decks haven't really existed a lot. And I think it's easy to look at something like Wiccan, at something like Arishem, at something like Afflict, and say, the reason these decks don't work is because they got power crept. That's not really why. It's because their prey disappeared from the environment. These were predators that were specialized to attack certain things. And I think Afflict is a great example of this. The other two are mostly just leveraging energy advantage in order to just have more points than the decks that are trying to counter them. So when they're, going face to face, you just kind of are naturally bigger. To use a Magic the Gathering analogy, it's the deck full of hill giants versus the deck full of grizzly bears. Arishem and Wiccan were trying to be the hill giants to the Shang-Chi deck's grizzly bears. This is a bit of a different thing, but Afflict does fit in that conversation because what Afflict did was have a bunch of really big guys at a really low cost that didn't get Shang-Chi'd, basically. That was like a big part of why it was a good deck. Was like, you're doing your stuff, but I execute my game plan and you can't do anything about it. And I have all these like ridiculously large men. As long as you don't have a Luke Cage, all my men are so big Like, I have a Man Thing. That's like a 413. That's really good, and you can't Shang-Chi it. And so not only are they bereft of their prey, they're bereft of the environment that kept the point total low enough that you could be impressed by a 413. That is what Shang-Chi was doing. There was a symbiotic relationship between these sort of predators of Shang-Chi decks and what Shang-Chi was doing to metagames that allowed them to sort of exist in the middle, beating the Shang-Chi decks, but nothing could actually go that far over the top because of how good the interaction used to be. And that's just not how it is anymore. And so when I look at this card, I see a card that I don't think is going to fix those fundamental problems. Afflict, I don't even know if it was supposed to be an archetype, you know? Like, that's kind of a decision they made later. Afflict used to just be like Hazmat and Luke Cage, and then they started making all these cards for it, right? They made Ajax, they made Man-Thing, they made Diamondback, they made these cards for the deck, and it's like, I don't know that they had a concrete idea of what the deck was supposed to be. And I think now that they're like, okay, this is an archetype, let's make these cards for the deck, like post Ajax, it's a deck. There's not necessarily a lack of recognition, but I do think that, like, while this card does solve some problems the deck has, it's a deck that needs unfair stuff drastically, the environment is so hostile to it that it's a bit like looking at a fish out of water and offering them, you know, not a tank to swim in, but like a Dasani. Like, it's a bit like that. Like, this is fine, but it's not fixing it, right? And the other thing, of course, is Luke Cage. We do have to talk about him. It's very difficult for a deck like this to ever become the best deck in the game, because for the second it becomes the best deck in the game, everyone just has a way to instantly beat it. And it's not like Luke Cage isn't the most easily hybridizable card into something like a Sholau. You can just play Luke Cage Mysterio instead of the Scarlet Spider stuff, and it's just the world's freest matchup. And as soon as this just gets just a whiff of people are like, I should try Afflict again, they just get hounded out of the meta by people that are able to do that, right? It is not a good spot for a deck to be in. It's not a good spot for an archetype to be in. And as much as I consider this card like a fairly interesting and compelling card, I cannot imagine it being a good long-term play. I'm going to give this 1.5 stars out of 5. Mother Ascani is quite a powerful copier. 4/4 on reveal, give the leftmost card in your hand +2 power, -1 cost, and then copy it. I think this is fairly clearly the kind of card I'm going to want to play in Victoria hand. The big question is, does it supplant Misery Hood for other people? I've already taken Misery Hood out of my V-hand deck in favor of my boy Lin Lie. So in the words of a great master, copying stuff is pretty good. Now, this is a card that I consider a very potent copier. It's going to be able to target specific things, and you're going to have to manipulate your hand in order to make that happen, but there are going to be some really powerful pop-off games with this. I would imagine it ends up superior to other 4-cost copiers like Bastion, because it gets you to keep those cards in hand, rather than exposing not only to your opponent the fact that you have them, but also to things like Deafening Chord and Cosmic Ghost Rider later in the game. This is a card that I consider to be one of the more powerful cards of the month, and even if I do expect it to pretty much just be a V-hand bot, I think that's a reasonable enough place for it to go. I waver between a 4 and a 4.5 star rating here. I think that 4 is closer to reality, but I think people will see a decent amount of this card. That said, it is an in-archetype all-star, which to me means that it is a 4-star card. A card that is an all-star in one archetype, but not the foundation of that archetype. Hard for me to go above a 4, even if I do think this card is going to be quite good. I think it's also possible that other things are able to benefit from this copy, but I consider it less likely because other copiers and duplicators, we actually kind of have plenty of those. The thing that specifically benefits from this is when you're trying to triple copy something that you're already copying. 3 Gambits, 3 V-Hands, 3 Linleys. All of those are things I want to do with this. And most importantly, this stacks with Moon Girl. The thing you copied is still cheaper. The thing you targeted with this is still cheaper. So when you Moon Girl them, you get copies that are cheaper and bigger. I am compelled by this card. I think it is a very good card, hence the 4-star rating. Storm, Horseman of Famine, is the card I am most scared of in this video. Not necessarily because I think it is the scariest card of the month, but I think it's the card that I am the most likely to drink the Kool-Aid on. If I am going to overrate any card in this video, I suspect it to be Storm, Horseman of Famine. That said, she is a 3/1 with an objective ability, and 2 turns in a row. Keep that in a row in mind. I think a lot of people miss that. With unspent energy, and then her reward is that she gives your other cards at her location and in your hand +2 power. I think this card is going to be really strong. I think that it's possible she is fully held back by the fact that she is linear scaling and that this is not a game about linear scaling and that in fact we really want to be multiplying our buffs, but I'm willing to be wrong. So I am going to say what my rating for Storm is, and then I'm going to try to justify it. I think Storm is a 4-star card. I think it is very, very likely that this, combined with the more mid-rangey versions of Star-Lord, mean that we actually have to start seriously considering High Evolutionary to be an archetype. I think it is extremely possible that this is what that deck is actually missing. And I also realize I am the king of High Evolutionary cope. I love coping this. I love the idea that you have this card that turns all of your cards from Series 1 into cards that are actually good. High Evolutionary doesn't do that on his own now. But this, with that additional power, might actually be able to do so. And I think that High Evolutionary could legitimately be an actual deck with this card. More than that, I just think that this card as a buff card is still going to be pretty good. A Silver Surfer type deck, which, let's be honest, probably shouldn't even be playing Silver Surfer. We're probably just playing buff slop at this point, is non-zero compelled by what this card is asking to do. You play nothing on turn 1, you play a 1-drop on turn 2, you play this on turn 3 in the same location as the 1-drop, you have ended multiple turns, you get the trigger on 3, you buff the 1-drop, you get all your cards in hand to be bigger and bigger and bigger. +2 power to all your cards in hand is not nothing. It really is not. Now, I don't know exactly how this card is going to go down. I also think that a card like Magus could be a very interesting card in terms of copying the text here. I don't necessarily know that that will 100% work, but I think it probably will. This is a card that I think is powerful. If it is held back, it will be held back by its shells and not by its own power. This is going to be one of the best cards in the decks that play it. It's just, I'm not sure those decks are going to be as good as I want them to be. That said, I do think they're going to be good. So I'm going to stick with my 4 out of 5. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.